The morning the HOA sent a mini excavator to tear down my garage, it was 9 degrees outside, and by nightfall, 400 homes had no heat, including the one where Cynthia Reeve, the woman who signed the demolition order, was trying to keep her mother alive. I didn't do that to her. I want to be clear about that up front, because everyone got it backwards later. I spent 31 years as a gas distribution engineer for a utility in 3 states, and the one thing that job burns into you is that you never, ever act on a system you don't understand. The HOA didn't understand what was under my garage. I did. I warned them, in writing, 3 times. They tore it down anyway. Let me back up. My name is Walter Kovac. I'm 62, widowed 2 years, and I moved to a place called Cottonwood Bend outside Wichita because it was flat, quiet, and cheap, and because after Denise died, I could not stand our old house with all its noise of her still in it.
Cottonwood Bend is one of those planned subdivisions where the streets are named after trees that were bulldozed to build it. 411 homes, a clubhouse, a pool nobody my age uses, and an HOA board run, at the time I arrived, by a woman named Cynthia Reeve. My lot was on the old edge of the development, the last one platted, backing onto a utility right-of-way. The house came with a detached garage, cinderblock, older than the subdivision itself, ugly as a bunker. I loved it. I put my workbench in it, and on my second week there, reading my own title the way I read everything, slow and twice, I found the paragraph that would eventually cost Cynthia Reeve her house, her board seat, and very nearly her mother. There was a recorded easement across my lot, a big one. The regional gas utility, Kanwaka Energy, held a right-of-way through the back of my property, and my ugly cinderblock garage sat directly over a below-grade vault. Inside that vault was a district regulator station and an emergency shutoff, the single manual valve that isolated the entire north feed serving 4 subdivisions, mine included. 411 homes in Cottonwood Bend, plus 3 developments past it. The garage had been built over the vault decades earlier by the farmer who owned the land before any of this existed, with a hatch in the slab for access. The easement required that access be kept clear. I knew what that meant. Most people wouldn't. A district regulator is the thing that steps high-pressure gas down to the pressure that's safe for your furnace. If it fails, you don't get a gentle outage. You get either no gas to 400 homes in January, or, if a regulator sticks open, overpressure downstream, which is how you put a fireball through somebody's basement. That valve in my garage was the manual last resort, the thing a utility crew grabs when everything automated has gone wrong. So when the first HOA notice showed up taped to my door, violation, unapproved outbuilding, $50 fine, structure must be remediated or removed, I didn't panic. I walked it over to the clubhouse and I explained, calmly, engineer to volunteer, that the unapproved outbuilding was older than the HOA, was grandfathered, sat over a live gas regulator vault, and was subject to a recorded utility easement that legally outranked anything in their bylaws. Cynthia Reeve listened to about half of it. She was maybe 55, brisk, a former regional manager for a rental car chain, the kind of person who has confused being organized with being right for so long that the two have fused. She had a binder. She loved the binder. "Mr. Kovac," she said, "I appreciate the color commentary, but the Architectural Committee has ruled the structure non-conforming. There's no easement noted in our community plat." "It's not in your plat?" I said. "It's in the county records, recorded 1971. It runs with the land. Your plat doesn't get to unrecord it." "Then you can take that up with the utility." She closed the binder. "The structure comes down, or the fines compound at $50 a day." I want to tell you I stayed cool. I mostly did. But I remember my hands on the counter
and the old anger coming up my arms. The specific fury of a technical man being overruled by someone who thinks a binder is the same as knowing something. I did it the right way anyway. That's the part that still makes me tired. I sent Kanwaka Energy a certified letter, telling them the HOA intended to demolish a structure over their regulator vault and asking them to intervene. I sent the HOA a certified letter with the recorded easement attached, the parcel number, the vault location, and one sentence in bold. This structure protects emergency access to a district gas regulator serving approximately 400 homes. Demolition may damage or obstruct it. I sent a copy to the county. I dated everything. 31 years of documenting jobs, and the habit walks off the clock with you and into your own driveway. Kanwaka's response was a form letter that said my inquiry had been routed to the appropriate department. The HOA's response was a second notice with a higher number on it. Then it went quiet for 6 weeks, and I made the mistake of thinking quiet meant over. It didn't mean over. It meant Cynthia Reeve had taken my certified letter to the HOA's lawyer, a strip mall guy named Pruitt, who billed the association by the hour, and had every incentive to find me wrong. And Pruitt had told her, I saw this later in discovery, that easements of that age are frequently abandoned, and that if the utility hadn't shown up to object, they'd probably released it in practice. He advised her the HOA could remove the structure and let me sue if I didn't like it. Cheaper to demolish and litigate, he said, than to lose face backing down. He was wrong about the easement, but he was right that the utility wasn't going to show up, and I've thought a lot about why. Kanwaka had been bought 2 years earlier by a private equity-backed holding company called Meridian Utility Partners, and Meridian had done what those outfits do: gutted the local engineering staff, outsourced records to a scanning vendor in another state, and let the institutional memory walk out the door with the pensions. My certified letter went into a queue that no longer had a human who knew what a district regulator vault was. Nobody was coming. The people who would have come had been laid off to improve a margin. So on a 9-degree morning in January, I heard a diesel engine in my driveway, and I came out in my coat to find a mini excavator, a 2-man crew, and Cynthia Reeve in a parka holding her binder, supervising the demolition of the one structure standing between 400 families and a very cold night. I stood in front of the bucket. I'm not proud of it, but I did. I had the recorded easement in a Ziploc bag against the snow, and I held it up and I told the operator, a kid maybe 25, exactly what was under the slab. To his credit, he stopped. He looked at Cynthia. "He's stalling," she said. "There's a court order behind the removal. He's had every chance." There wasn't a court order. There was a lawyer's letter she was calling a court order, and the kid didn't know the difference. And the fines had been compounding on his boss's invoice, too. He put the bucket back in the block. They didn't hit the valve. That's the thing people always assume. The bucket didn't dramatically shear a gas main. What happened was quieter and worse. The excavator cracked the old slab, collapsed a corner of the vault, and buried the access hatch under a ton of broken cinder block and frozen dirt. The regulator underneath kept working. For 11 days, it kept working. And then, in the first hard, cold snap of February, with demand spiking across all 4 subdivisions, the regulator did what unmaintained regulators do under peak load. It started to fail, drifting toward overpressure, and the automated telemetry that should have flagged it had been decommissioned in Meridian's efficiency modernization. And the manual shutoff, the last resort, the thing a crew grabs when everything else fails, was under a ton of rubble that used to be my garage. I know exactly when it started because Kanwaka finally called me. Not the HOA, me, because I was still listed in their ancient records as the easement contact, and some engineer 3 states away, watching a pressure anomaly he couldn't explain, pulled up the vault and saw a note that a Walter Kovac had sent a certified letter about obstruction. He called me at 11 at night and said, "Sir, is there any chance you can get us access to the North District manual isolation valve?" And I said, "Your customers demolished the access to it 6 weeks ago. I sent you a letter." There was a long silence on the phone. Then he said the thing I'll remember the rest of my life. He said, "There's nobody local. It's going to take a crew 4 hours to get there from Topeka, and I don't think we have 4 hours." Here's where it stops being a property dispute and becomes the worst night of a lot of people's lives. They cut the north feed. They had to. An overpressure event across 4 subdivisions is a mass casualty scenario. Basements and pilot lights and 400 furnaces. And the only safe move when you can't reach the local isolation valve is to kill the entire upstream feed. So they killed it. At 2 in the morning, in single-digit cold, 411 homes in Cottonwood Bend and roughly 1,300 more past it lost all gas. No heat, no hot water, furnaces dead, in February, in Kansas. You cannot just turn gas back on either. Once a system that size is depressurized, you can't flip a switch. Every single service has to be physically relit by a technician, house by house, meter by meter, or you risk filling homes with gas. For a utility that had laid off its local crews, that meant days. 4 days, as it turned out, of a whole community running space heaters off overloaded circuits, sleeping in cars, crowding into the one church with a wood stove, while Meridian bussed in contractors from 3 states to relight 1,900 homes, one at a time. 2 houses caught fire from space heaters. Nobody died in those, thank God. But an 80-year-old man on the far subdivision died of a heart attack shoveling his own driveway to get out to a warming center. And I will not pretend the cold didn't kill him, because it did. And Cynthia Reeve. Cynthia Reeve's mother, Dorothy, 87, lived with her. Dorothy was on supplemental oxygen and had a furnace like everyone else, and a daughter who had personally ordered the demolition of the emergency shutoff for a subdivision she was trying to run like a rental car franchise. When the heat died, Cynthia put her mother in the car with the engine running for warmth and drove her 40 minutes to the hospital in Wichita, and Dorothy survived. And I think about the fact that the woman who caused it was also that night its most frightened victim. I found all of this out later, in pieces, the way you find out about a disaster you predicted and couldn't stop. What I did that first night was drive to the church with the wood stove and help. I'm a gas engineer. I knew how to safely bleed and cap the dead lines. I knew which space heaters were going to burn somebody's house down. I knew how to talk to the frightened contractors from Missouri who'd never seen a district this size. I worked 41 hours with maybe 2 of sleep, and somewhere in the middle of it, around a folding table in a church basement at 4 in the morning, I ended up across from Cynthia Reeve, who had come back from the hospital to help hand out blankets because she could not sit still with what she'd done. She didn't recognize me at first. Coats, exhaustion, everyone gray-faced. Then she did, and something went out of her face. "You sent letters," she said. It wasn't a question. "You sent letters and I called them color commentary." I could have said a lot of things. I'd rehearsed some of them for 6 weeks. What I actually said was, "Is your mother okay?" She started crying, the ugly, exhausted kind. And she said her mother was okay. And then she said, "Pruitt told me the easement was abandoned. He told me you'd fold." And I understood, in that basement, that Cynthia Reeve was a fool and a bully, and also a person who had been handed a confident lie by a man she was paying to be confident, and that the truly guilty party in this was not standing in the church at all. He was in a boardroom in another state, and his name was Meridian. And he had figured out that you could buy a utility, strip out everyone who knew where the valves were, and let the savings fall to the bottom line, and that when it went wrong, the blame would land on a local HOA lady and a dead man's garage. The lawsuits came like weather. Homeowners sued the HOA. The HOA sued Pruitt for malpractice. Everyone sued Meridian. And Meridian's lawyers did the thing I'd watched that whole industry learn to do. They blamed the demolition. They stood up and said, in effect, the system would have been fine if a local HOA hadn't buried the manual isolation valve and pointed at Cynthia Reeve and tried to make a rental car manager with a binder the sole cause of a 4-subdivision gas failure. That's when I stopped being a victim and became a witness. And I want to tell you it felt good, but mostly it felt like work. Because I had the letters. I had 31 years of knowing how to build a timeline nobody could argue with. I had my certified letter to Kanwaka, the one that went into Meridian's dead queue, proving they were told about the obstruction 6 weeks before the failure and did nothing. I had the utility's own decommissioning records, subpoenaed, showing they'd ripped out the telemetry that would have caught the overpressure early. I had the maintenance logs showing that regulator hadn't been physically inspected in 4 years, since the last local crew was cut. And I had the one document that turned it from negligence into something with a longer prison number attached. An internal Meridian memo, pulled in discovery, in which a regional VP acknowledged that decommissioning local emergency response across the acquired territory created elevated but acceptable public safety risk, and recommended not disclosing the change to the State Utility Commission because it would complicate the rate case. They knew that stripping out the local crews meant that if anything went wrong, nobody could reach the valves in time, and they decided the risk was acceptable, and they hid it from the regulator so they could keep charging rates as if the safety systems still existed. That memo is the reason there's now a federal case, because concealing a known public safety hazard from a state commission to protect a rate filing isn't an HOA squabble. It's wire fraud, and it's endangerment, and when the U.S. Attorney's Office got hold of that memo, the whole thing stopped being about my garage. Here's how it actually landed, because I know that's what you want. The court ruled the easement was valid and had never been abandoned. Recorded rights don't evaporate because a lawyer wishes they would. The HOA's demolition was declared unlawful, and Pruitt, the strip mall lawyer who'd called a live gas easement probably released in practice, lost his malpractice case and, last I heard, his license. The HOA's insurance paid the homeowners, and the board that Cynthia had run was dissolved and rebuilt with actual rules about not demolishing utility infrastructure. But the weight came down on Meridian, where it belonged. The concealment memo turned the civil case into a rout and handed the federal prosecutors their opening. Meridian settled the class action for a number with a lot of zeros, funded the permanent restaffing of local emergency crews across the whole territory as part of a consent decree, and its regional VP, the one who wrote elevated but acceptable, was indicted. The state commission clawed back the rates. It will be in appeals for years. It should be. And Cynthia Reeve. People wanted her strung up, and I understood why, and for a while I was one of them. But she'd been the tool, not the hand. She lost the house, the legal bills took it, and she pled to a misdemeanor and did community service, and the prosecutors, once they had the memo, mostly lost interest in the rental car manager and went hunting bigger game. The last real conversation we had, she asked me why I kept the letters, all of them, dated, for 6 weeks, when I could see they were ignoring me. I told her the truth. I told her that in 31 years of gas engineering, I learned that the only thing that survives a disaster is the paper that proves what people knew and when they knew it. That the valve fails, the telemetry fails, the crews get cut, the lawyers lie, but the certified letter with the date stamp does not change its story. You don't keep the record to win. You keep it because someday it's the only honest witness in the room. They rebuilt the vault, by the way. Kanwaka, under new management now, forced by the consent decree, came out and rebuilt the regulator station with a proper above-grade access enclosure, code-compliant, painted utility yellow, sitting right where my ugly cinderblock garage used to be. It's the least attractive thing on the street. The new HOA can't do a thing about it. It's protected by a recorded easement from 1971 that outranks every binder in Kansas. I keep my workbench in a shed now on the other side of the lot. Some mornings I take my coffee out and look at that yellow enclosure humming quietly to itself, stepping the pressure down safe for 400 furnaces, and I think the same thing every time. Nobody claps for the thing that keeps the heat on. They only learn its name the winter somebody paves it over. Here's what actually happened, underneath the drama. An HOA fined a man $50 over an ugly garage, and 400 homes lost heat in February because that garage was the only access to the emergency shutoff for the whole district's gas. But notice the real chain of failure. Cynthia Reeve was a bully with a binder, and she was wrong, and she still wasn't the cause. The cause was a private equity utility that bought Kanwaka, laid off every local engineer who knew where the valves were, ripped out the telemetry, and hid that gutting from the state regulator to protect a rate case, writing in its own memo that the risk to the public was elevated but acceptable. The legal spine here is real and worth knowing. A recorded easement runs with the land. It does not abandon itself because a board's plat forgot to mention it, or a lawyer finds it inconvenient. Utility rights-of-way generally outrank HOA architectural rules, full stop. And the moment a company conceals a known safety hazard from a public commission to protect its revenue, an ordinary negligence case becomes federal. Wire fraud, endangerment, the whole heavier shelf. The $50 fine was never the story. The story was a memo in a boardroom 3 states away. Walter won the only way people like him ever win. He kept the paper. Certified letters, dated, ignored, filed anyway. The boring habit that turned out to be the single honest witness when the valves and the telemetry and the lawyers had all failed. So I'll leave you with the question that sits under this one. When someone with a binder and a lawyer tells you the boring thing you're worried about has probably been abandoned, do you fold? Or do you keep the letter? Because someday, the letter is all that's left.